When I first heard fans discussing Silent Hill F negatively, I was surprised. Having seen the trailer the night it was announced, I was shocked and awed at it, extremely excited for whatever the game would become. But in the comments on my videos on it, there were always a handful that were disappointed. And it was always in comparison to Fatal Frame, essentially stating that the change in locale meant the game had transformed entirely. To be set in Japan meant Silent Hill had to be a different kind of game, essentially a Fatal Frame clone. On its surface, the argument is weird. Why should a game series that has never fully set its experience in the same place twice, expanding locations, changing the town's landscape, constantly adding to and stretching the definition of Silent Hill, why should moving country suddenly change the entire nature of the piece, especially when a return to Eastern developers has been demanded by fans for so long? Examined further, I found more flaws with the argument. On its surface, you could say Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones must be the same. They feature similar locales. Deeper experience with both works reveals they are very much not the same, but they certainly have similarities, and a Silent Hill in Japan would probably feature some similarities to Fatal Frame. That's simply because it would be using Japanese visual symbolism more overtly than in the past. Japanese influence has always been there, but the visuals were all Western. Here, in Japan, a Silent Hill story is waiting to be told that uses a different culture entirely. And a lot of the issue, I think, is how deeply Western fans associate the game with a kind of homage to and critique of Western civilization that has been present in many of the games, but it is not a necessity either. All of this has made me consider what it is that actually defines Silent Hill, and Fatal Frame for that matter. Why are they different? What creates the DNA of these series? What sets them apart? What makes them Silent Hill and Fatal Frame? The older of the two series is certainly Silent Hill, beginning its life on the PlayStation in 1999. The story of a father and a missing daughter, a mysterious town, a strange cult, and the birth of a god. It's an incredibly unique and strange tale, a masterful blend of Western media and influences through a Japanese viewpoint. The story began as an adaptation of Stephen King's The Mist, itself a critique of American society, religion, and the tendency to become a mob and gang up on others, particularly in stressful, dangerous times. The story centers on a man trying to protect his son. The novel ending is ambiguous, while the film ends with the tragedy of the father killing his child to save them from the monsters, mere moments before rescue comes. It feels like a tragic ending out of spite, and personally it turned me off of the narrative for the most part. The explanation for the supernatural in the story is also rooted in critique of American culture. The fog and the monsters come from another reality which enters this one due to a mishap with a government experiment. No supernatural elements. This story is more science fiction and horror, after all. Silent Hill wouldn't keep most of the Mist's plotline, and what it does keep, it changes. The monsters and fog remain, but the scientific explanation is gone. The religious fundamentalism is there, but it is changed in style and tone, and the father protecting his child is also, of course, present. But the presentation of these themes is very Japanese in style and function. Cults are a major part of Japanese history. There are tons of examples of real-world religious cults and extremist actions taken by them, and because of that, Japanese fiction has also adapted the concept of religious cults and used it heavily. While in the original novel, the fundamentalism developed as a consequence of the supernatural events as an explanation for them, the mob driven to attempt to sacrifice people to placate the monsters. The supernatural explanation also feels very different. For one, it is never fully explained, a tradition that is paramount in Japanese fiction. Ambiguity, leaving it to the imagination, leaving some threads unexplained. It's very common in Japanese media, and from what I've read, a popular understanding of why that is the ability to allow the audience to interpret and understand the narrative themselves, to essentially leave room for conversation and debate. A solid, certain explanation cuts off dialogue. Leaving the audience with questions invites discussion. While obviously this isn't true of every single piece of Japanese media, having read a lot of horror and mystery from both East and West, I'd say there's a definite higher trend of ambiguity in Japan than over here. The first game establishes a strange world of unexplained supernatural abilities and otherworldly events. We know some of the why, but not all of it, and the endings are all rather open-ended, save the worst one. The god is stopped, and so far as we know, the cult is defeated. The father escapes, and in the canonical ending saves some version of his daughter. This element of multiple selves, of reincarnation and split souls, is heavily Japanese too. The second game would almost go entirely off the rails from this setup and scenario. It's an incredibly daring risk when you think about it. The first game was so successful, to take away everything that made it so and start from scratch is very daring. But it can't have gotten rid of everything, so what did it keep? You could say Silent Hill, but I think that's a little vague. This game does not have to be set in Silent Hill to be Silent Hill 2. By that I mean, the story of James and his wife is central to James himself. He must be present in the narrative, but nothing about the town makes it where the story has to be, other than that's what they chose to do. They could have created a whole new series with a new premise and started from there, because nothing about Silent Hill 1 is integral to Silent Hill 2. They make connections, of course, they tie pieces of it together, but those pieces could be cut out of the narrative, and they would remove nothing of importance from the story at its heart. What I'm trying to say is that Silent Hill 2 is a story about James Sunderland, not a story about Silent Hill. Silent Hill is the set dressing, but it's not incredibly necessary. Oh, but the town is what manifests monsters and delusions. Well, many fictional places and horror stories have similar concepts. Nothing about Silent Hill requires it to be the place James had to come to. To better understand what I mean, consider Fatal Frame, which happened to come out the same year as Silent Hill 2. The first game is the story of a young girl looking for her brother in an ancient, mysterious mansion. Things go very wrong, of course. She becomes trapped in this terrible place, which is cursed by ancient rituals gone wrong. Those rituals are heavily intertwined with the culture and world they are built upon. You cannot tell this story in the American Midwest. It is a Shinto, Buddhist tradition that explains the how and why of the events of this game. And on top of that, it is one rooted in the Japanese past, some hundreds of years ago. It has to be this place at this time. Compared to Silent Hill, there is nothing about James's story that has to be in the town, but the story of Fatal Frame cannot be moved to another place or another country. It has to be in a rural, traditional Japanese mansion. So by comparison, that makes Fatal Frame a story about place, not about person, while Silent Hill is the opposite. The story of James Sunderland is his story set in Silent Hill, but the story of Fatal Frame's haunted mansion doesn't necessarily need its main character, Miku Hinasaki. With barely any adjustments, you could put a different person, looking for something or someone else, in the same role with no changes to the major narrative. You could not do that to Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 is a story about psychology. So much of the narrative is built around characters' minds, the lies they tell themselves and others, the traumas they've suffered, the way those things influence their behavior, their choices. So much is built around their personal experience. Not so for Miku Hinasaki. The girl herself barely has any dialogue beyond a shocked gasp or stunned expression. In fact, that's her major role for the game. Most of the cutscenes involve a shocking event and a display of our main character's fear in a somewhat exaggerated or stylized fashion. We know nothing about Miku at this point besides the fact she and her brother see ghosts, and her brother is missing. More can be learned about her. Much of the story involves her family and ancestors, but it's not made incredibly clear, and it isn't that integral to our experience. We never get that kind of heartfelt dialogue of James talking to Pyramid Head or Maria in the jail cell. That's not Fatal Frame's purpose for its characters. Take a step back, and let's consider some other Japanese media. The stage. Kabuki and No and other older Japanese stage forms are incredibly stylized. There's very little use of stage decor or prop work compared to the West. The performance is almost entirely on the actor's shoulders, and there are usually not that many of them. In No, masks are involved. In Kabuki, there's very stylized makeup. Even in Japan, these traditions are considered somewhat difficult to get into and understand, because typical storytelling traditions are transformed into certain specialized movements, costumes, or song and dance, and they aren't immediately understood by the uninformed. You have to know that certain masks or makeups represent certain character types, who always perform certain roles. You have to know that a certain dance represents some action or part of the narrative that may not be directly explained. You may even need to know the myth the story is based on to better understand what's happening. Fatal Frame has that same kind of heavy, stylized performance, lacking what we might consider modern narrative developments. Silent Hill is very modern by comparison. We learn about characters, we hear their personal thoughts and feelings, we see memories and vivid expressions. Fatal Frame hides all of that behind a performance. Characters are incredibly beautiful, young, and stylized in a somewhat feminine, almost Lolita-like fashion, something that doesn't come across as a person but as a character. Miku does not tell us what she thinks and feels. We know little of her heart. The same is true of her brother and the ghosts themselves. The family head character is reduced to his role as a frightful, murdering ghost. We know the crimes he committed, but we know little about the man he was, the indecisions he might suffer, the possible conflicts he faced. The only character who has a little of that modern style is the central ghost, Kyrie, and I would still argue we learn far less about her than is typical of a modern storytelling style. The characters play a role, easily compared to the roles to be found in a folk or fairy tale: the evil queen, the innocent princess, the hunter. In Fatal Frame, the protagonist is the princess, an innocent, beautiful, vulnerable damsel in a terrible situation, someone who we can watch suffer and cry out and be moved by their suffering. The ghosts are also very stylized and beautiful. Their movements, their clothing, their faces, none of them are grotesque, gory, or what we might consider unattractive. They are beautiful to look at. The horror comes from their nature and their role. Let's step forward and explore Silent Hill 3. This story is very different from 2. It's in fact necessary to place this game in Silent Hill because it continues the story of the first game. This was a reaction to Japanese fans in particular. They were upset at the lack of a continuing narrative, and the KSET team felt they had to provide one. So it does draw a great deal from Silent Hill 1. It includes a cult, a story of a girl with multiple selves and cycles of lives, though it does not start in the town. Silent Hill 3 being the beginning of an attempt to stretch what Silent Hill could be, in order to include new, more interesting places. Like 2, however, 3 does continue the heavy focus on psychology, on modernity, on character as the heart of the narrative. The story is Heather's, and there's a heavy focus on her feelings and reactions to the world around her. The ultimate story is about her and the god inside her, and the town is a backdrop. While it has to be in this place to continue the first game's narrative, I would argue the story is still more about Heather and the loss of her father than it is about a haunted town and a cult inside it. Those are just set dressings to the emotional character journey we are on. Here we begin to more easily see the major differences between a Silent Hill and Fatal Frame, because in 3 we have our first female protagonist. Nothing about Heather's treatment in this game is similar to Miku Hinasaki or Mio and Mayu of the second game. She is not an idealized beauty. She's not a dainty, delicate flower. She's just an ordinary girl with enough elements of her just a little out of place to feel real. Her comfy boots and feminine skirt, her hair with the fading roots and the blemishes on her face. Her dialogue emphasizes that too. She speaks like a modern teenager. She acts like one, kicking things in anger, commenting on how she tried to smoke, pulling pranks on Douglas. She's just a female fictional character. Fatal Frame isn't trying to do that, because this isn't a modern horror story. We are in the ancient world, where in Japanese ghost stories the women were all very beautiful and tragic, and the men were all honorable and ill-fated. Read any old Japanese ghost story and you'll see the connections. It's a world of idealized people, which makes the tragedies worse. How terrible for this young, beautiful, perfect ideal of a girl, with all her life to look forward to, have it end in tragedy and betrayal. Fatal Frame follows the pattern. It is writing a Japanese ghost story. It is performing a stage play with idealized and fictionalized people who are not modern characters but are traditional character types. The vengeful ghost, the innocent damsel, the noble friend, the tragic father. None of these characters that appear give us much insight into them beyond short diary entries and their ghostly wails. To the player, they are what they appear to be. Broken Neck is Broken Neck, a ghost who looks incredibly eerie and haunts the player. We don't address her as a person with a past or character motivations. To us, she just plays the role of a ghost. This is part of why I think Fatal Frame has never quite captured the West, or the United States at least, as it has part of the Eastern world like South Korea, China, and Japan. It is a style that seems very much to borrow from folk tales and older-fashioned storytelling models that the US doesn't seem as keen on, possibly in part because it's not as big a part of our culture. Telling ghost stories is huge in Japan, even today, and there are many artistic traditions surrounding it. The closest comparison in the West may be the Gothic novel tradition, but even that has a far more modern narrative bent, sometimes blending with the mystery novel or detective story for its explanations. The Fatal Frame style is just a bit different, in my opinion, to what the average American horror fan is interested in, at least back when the games first came out. Now, with the world more fully integrated into the internet, with it easier to enjoy works that are centuries old or from other cultures, I'd bet there's at least a slight shift in interest, but it still pales in comparison to Silent Hill in the USA. Monsters in Silent Hill have meaning. They have a psychological depth, a deep explanation for their appearance, their role, their location in the game. But Fatal Frame's ghosts' psychology has less to do with their personal character than it does the audience they are performing for. How they appear relates to how the developers felt we would feel upon seeing them. How could they tap into the primal fear of death and pain in the audience through the appearance and role of the ghost? The woman that falls from the stairwell, her body shattering, attacks us with her limbs all broken and her neck falling back. We see a human body distorted, a woman clearly writhing in pain. We have to actually hear and see her death replaying whenever you go through the area. Yet she is beautiful, with a heavy bosom central to her figure, her long black hair framing a lovely face. We are presented with a horrific image meant to tear at our hearts, to show us someone lovely who suffered a dismal fate. Beauty and horror, revulsion and attraction, those two have been placed side by side in Japanese tradition before. The Buddhist tradition has the idea of contemplating decay, to divorce yourself from concern with this life, face the disgusting, revolting elements of it, the rotting corpses, the dead. This transformed into an art style, and in Japan it even became associated with one of the most loved women of her age, Ono no Komachi. Her name is still a synonym for beauty and loveliness, but there's an entire stage play centered on her ending her life in poverty and ugliness and despair. Japan sets these side by side in countless forms of media. And in more modern ages, there is Ero-guro. When pornographic and violent art was pushed underground by the government in the early 20th century, it began to develop into even more forbidden and often intertwined styles. Ero-guro was violent, sexually explicit art, very popular during the World Wars. And it hasn't gone away. Explore any major Japanese horror franchise and you'll probably find a lot more sexual content for its own sake than you'd expect, often to shock, titillate, and create discomfort. That combination of revulsion and attraction. The Japanese culture has always been more interested in death than many other cultures the world over. It has suffered from very long periods of warfare, and a very rigid class system which at times gave the powerful carte blanche to kill whoever they wanted for whatever reason. From the ancient sacrificial traditions to samurai seppuku, to the farmers who sacrificed themselves to the government to alert their superiors to injustice, to the monks who entombed themselves alive, the lovers' suicides and suicide bombers, the suicide forests, the modern epidemic of overwork and death. The most popular folktale to the modern day is still 42 Ronin, that ends in all of them killing themselves. There has always been a tendency to romanticize death, which sometimes has tragic real-world effects. Fatal Frame is all about romanticizing death. The first game ends with a character choosing to spend his eternity as a ghost in what is essentially hell for a dead woman he just met. The second game ends with one twin murdering her sister, and that is what sets things to rights. Both these games are centered upon making you afraid and yet drawn to the things that frighten you. That instinct that as children had us cover our eyes yet leave a little gap in the fingers so we could peer into the darkness. It is a very eroguro, romanticized version of death which appears in Fatal Frame. This changes a little in the most modern version of the series, Fatal Frame 3. In this game, there's an attempt to really deal with the consequences of loss and feelings of despair that come after a loved one's death. For that reason, it's a little more mature, modern, and psychological. We learn more about Ray's thoughts and feelings than we do the other protagonists. She's also the oldest of the lot and the least idealized. She's closer to a modern female protagonist than she is a Lolita ideal. And even Miku, who appears in the game, is more normal in this variation than she is elsewhere. Yet when compared to games like Silent Hill 3 or other modern narrative styles, Fatal Frame 3 still has a lot of that heavy stylization, that folktale-style storytelling and focus on performance and visual elements, as compared to the inner psychological experience of its characters and its ghosts. In the ending, in which our protagonist meets with her dead lover at the edge of the world and is tempted to join him, it's an interesting scene to compare to Mary and James in 2. In Silent Hill, we see a husband and wife having a grounded and tragic reconciliation or confrontation about their marriage, and it ends with Mary's heartfelt letter, full of the real-world considerations of what happens to a marriage during hospice and end-of-life care. But Ray and Yu's meeting in Fatal Frame is far more idealized. It doesn't feel grounded or real. It feels like a fairy tale, two-parted lovers meeting at a supernatural place surrounded by the dead, both beautiful and haunting, being driven apart by cruel fate. It's almost a haunting twist on the Tanabata story of the two lovers who can only meet once a year when the stars Vega and Altair come together. This shows an important difference between the two series and how they handle the central concern of death. Both have, in a fashion, ghosts in their narratives, even when they aren't called ghosts. Both deal with parting and separation, with the tragedies of our lives and their bitter, terrible ends. But one presents them in a modern, realistic fashion, with James and Mary dealing with many years of caretaking and hospice, with Heather finding her father and falling to her knees, spending a good long while talking about her father and how she feels in the car surrounded by rain. These are scenes that could be taken out of the real-world experiences of any of us. They resemble how real people deal with and handle the realities of death. Even if the scenarios are supernatural, the feelings are grounded and real. Of course, Fatal Frame also deals with sorrow and loss, but it is in a heightened, fantastical manner. Miu and Mayu spend their game trying to avoid death, only for Mayu to really be craving it. In a twisted way, the story turns on us. We become unwilling murderers ourselves. The entire game centers on the tragedy of the village and its unlucky twins, only for us to fall victim to the same curse. Miku's brother chooses to stay with a dead girl. Ray spends a lot of her game quite literally chasing her fiancé's ghost. There is love intertwined with death in these narratives, that attraction and repulsion that reflects how we as people are terrified of death but also fascinated with it. After all, we're playing these games, aren't we? Silent Hill lacks that romanticized fascination. Death is death, even when it's not permanent. It's a terrible, painful reality, one we cannot ignore or look away from. one we must all eventually face. But more than the reality of death, it is the reality of loss which is central to the Silent Hill narratives. Each and every game has this single thread running through it: the love we feel for others, and the grief that comes when we lose them, and the struggle to live on in spite of that loss and grief. Harry's beloved daughter vanishes into the fog. In the canonical ending, he loses Cheryl and fails to save Alessa, Sybil, or Lisa. Dahlia and Kaufman, far less innocent but also human beings, also die. Harry is the sole survivor, with a strange newborn child he must now raise. In my previous video, I called this a tragic ending, and not everyone agreed, but consider the facts. The first time, Harry and his wife found an unexpected blessing on the side of the road. A wife and husband, much in love, now have the chance to raise a baby together, to experience all those firsts, to share their new child with their families, to watch the next generation grow up. Tragically, Harry loses his wife 4 years ago, making Cheryl about 3 when she died, just young enough to barely remember her. Still, she likely would have some positive inkling of the mother that loved her, and Harry would have those shared friends and family members who also lost her. Now things are different. Cheryl is gone too. Every last connection to his wife and the daughter they raised together, all gone. He can't return to that old life. How to explain to them that Cheryl, his 7-year-old, has been replaced with an infant? In an instant, he has lost every part of his old life, every person he knew and every member of his family he loved. If he is to raise this child, he will have to give it all up. And he will raise her, and see in her the shadow of Cheryl that's gone, and the shadow of memories of watching her first steps with his wife, putting her to bed with his wife. Those are memories of another life now, of people who are dead or don't exist, and no one else is left who remembers them. How is this not a tragedy of incredible proportions? Harry cannot even really talk about his wife with his daughter Heather. How to tell stories of her infancy when his wife was not there? Harry doesn't know if Heather is the same child or not. Does he pretend and tell her stories about Cheryl's childhood? Is that denying the existence of the first child he loved so much? There are so many complications and problems that arise with this new baby, all of them falling heavily on the newly single father's shoulders, when he just lost his first child, and he must now raise this one alone. That's the heart of Silent Hill. Grief. Silent Hill 2 is all about one man's inability to face his wife's death. 3 is about Heather's loss of her father and her coming to terms with grief. 4 deals with a young man watching his neighbors suffering extreme tragedies and being helpless to stop it. And so on and so forth. Every single game is, at its heart, a story centered on character, on a modern psychological storytelling style in which personal loss and grief are the tantamount themes. Death does not exist in the same context in Fatal Frame. It is not the great separator. It is not a story necessarily about loss. The central focus on ghosts already presents us with a world in which the dead are not so far from us as we think. Existing in a specific religious context, it also presents us with a possible future reunion with our loved ones, as ghosts or in a second existence, that is not present in Silent Hill. There is an ambiguity, a mystery to Silent Hill and death that is true to our real-world experience. Fatal Frame deals instead with the horror of ghosts. But the real source of fear in the narrative comes from its cultural context, and that too is rather far removed from the Western experience. This is a heavily religious series in the sense that it's built on Shinto and Buddhist Japanese traditions. That worldview is inherent in this universe, and it's validated in the sense that the supernatural is very obviously real in this world. In a realistic scenario, we can easily condemn any village that sacrifices children to ward off hell as evil incarnate. Not so in Fatal Frame, because in this universe there is a terrible evil that is held at bay by these rituals. The rituals themselves are heinous and full of suffering. The narrative never denies that. It also does not invalidate their necessity. In each game, the characters are often repeating the rituals or even finishing them, sometimes leading to more necessary deaths. The problem at the heart of the story is the failed ritual, often due to human failures, due to the natural consequences of imperfect people living in this imperfect world. Neither are these people condemned either. Kyrie is a complicated, sympathetic figure who in the canonical ending willingly damns her spirit to hold back the gate she failed to seal with her death. Miku's brother willingly stays with her. There's sympathy in her character's portrayal, even as she is presented as the reason for all these people's deaths. Because she did not properly finish the ritual, because she fell in love, these things happen. There is no real moral judgment present in the narratives, no good or bad guy, no obvious villain or wrong choices. There are merely consequences. Because one girl fell in love, she began to long to live. Because she had longing, the ritual failed. But can any of us condemn a human being for love? The narrative doesn't. Instead, it presents the horrifying as horrifying and the sympathetic as sympathetic. It is horrifying that a woman was blinded with a mask for a ritual in Himuro Mansion, and the story presents that scene as such, and the ghost is a sympathetic, tragic figure. But it does not condemn the Himuro master and the priest for it either. They die tragically because of the evil coming from the gate, which builds up because of the failed ritual. Their tragedies also happen simply because of natural human consequences. Shinto does not have a heavily moral element to it. It is about purity and impurity, about cause and effect. Because you have impurities, something ill shall befall you. Because you failed to be purified, something happened, and so on. There are no real moral elements to these things in the religious sense. Morality exists, of course, but Japan doesn't necessarily attach their moral compass to their Shinto gods in the same way the West does. This is the tragedy of Fatal Frame. It is a highly stylized, fantastical fairy tale of death and beauty, destruction and attraction that at its heart mirrors the human experience in which terrible things happen for no real reason. You can liken the tragedies in these games to natural disasters. Something happened because it is natural. As a consequence, people suffered. To put things to rights, someone else must also struggle and suffer, because that is the lot of humanity. It is a heavily Japanese, heavily Shinto viewpoint of existence, and it really doesn't fit into the Western Christian worldview, in which some behaviors and some choices are just always evil and wrong, no matter what. This is particularly interesting when you compare it to Silent Hill, since this is a world based on Western stories and culture, but still Japanese in its original form. It creates a weird blend of feeling, using Christian and Jewish imagery and Western religious ideas almost out of context. It's not entirely removed from religious feeling, but it almost is. The Lady of the Door in 2, the churches in 1 and 3, the riddles that reference religious thought. The symbols of these traditions are part of the background of the game, but the meaning of those symbols is almost entirely stripped away. This is not a religious narrative in the way that Fatal Frame is a Shinto narrative, a story that deals entirely with Shinto themes and concepts, twisting them into a dark, otherworldly version, to tell a story that would be extra meaningful and upsetting to anyone familiar with the religious tradition. The heaviest religious feelings to be found in Silent Hill happen to be in the morality of the narratives, the fact that most of the stories do have a basic alignment with Western morality. Killing is evil, and guilt is a punishment for sin. This is complicated by the complex nature of the crimes involved and the feelings of the main characters, but in a general sense, good is rewarded and wickedness is punished. This lack of heavy religious and cultural overtone are why I'm not concerned about Silent Hill moving to different countries the way other fans are. For one, we've already seen how little reality matters in this town. Who is to say it cannot exist wherever it wants to? Or that perhaps a doorway to it might pop up anywhere in the world. Some poor soul from anywhere could stumble into that haunted town in the USA. Or that whatever supernatural element at play behind it could also pop up somewhere else, if Silent Hill is a phenomenon rather than one unique place. Silent Hill's cultural and religious backing is so generalized and blended, it can move to any place on Earth. It is not so heavily rooted in Christianity as to be immovable, and the West has stretched so far and influenced so many places, it's not impossible to write a narrative about that culture in a place removed from it. Japan and the United States in particular have a close history that could lead to an incredibly tragic, fascinating story in this setting. Fatal Frame did not move, or at least would be relegated to cultures with certain similar backgrounds. For instance, the Dread Out series, heavily inspired by Fatal Frame, comparatively try to tell this story in Europe and the USA, and it would be unrecognizable. Our religions are too different. The point of Fatal Frame is that much of its terrible rituals, terrible as they are not necessarily un-Shinto or immoral in this context, acting as a kind of dark mirror to reality that makes the story work. So what does all of this mean? We can basically simplify the narratives of these two series to these points. Silent Hill focuses on character-driven stories, Fatal Frame on locational ones. Silent Hill is very modern in storytelling style, while Fatal Frame is far more culturally relative and stylized. The themes and manner of dealing with death is realistic and grounded in Silent Hill, and more romanticized in Fatal Frame. And the religious threads in Silent Hill are thin, while in Fatal Frame, they are the heart of the narrative. Then how does the trailer for Silent Hill F stand when we consider these facts? Well, if it were a Fatal Frame teaser, we would focus a lot more on the identity and beauty of the girl we are following. We don't see her face in this trailer, and there's not a single shot of a heaving breast or a dainty, scared face. The element of beauty and fear is present, but in a different way. It's the floral, natural beauty being tainted by an alien otherness that overtakes the woman and transforms her. That gory, nasty transformation is out of place in Fatal Frame, where the focus is on attraction above all, fear factor second, and there is no place at all for gore. The few times it appears, it is off-screen, implied, or a short flash of a scene. The locale is obviously Japanese, but this is just the fact of the game being in Japan. That's the setting. If it were Fatal Frame, however, it would be far less modern. It would be entirely in the rural, remote countryside in some ancient manor or temple. This is not that. We see modernity next to older elements. We see elements of old folktales next to signs of modern-day life. And the somber, sorrowful feeling of the trailer, its emptiness, the girl seeming to run from something she cannot escape, her inevitable death, has a heavy, grounded sadness and loss to it that is, you guessed it, very Silent Hill. I don't get a single feeling of Fatal Frame from this. There's none of the romance or sexuality. The location's heavily modern. There's not a single sexy ghost to be found. The girl seems ordinary, or at least not as stylized as a Miku or a Mio. She's not a Lolita teen, she's just a teenage girl, so it seems. And the strange otherworldly threat of the flowers, clearly supernatural but not easily explainable, leans towards the ambiguity of Silent Hill rather than the Shinto-inspired Fatal Frame, whose ghosts are easily explainable in a Shinto-Buddhist context. Ultimately, I don't know what this game will be or what it will be like. I think it's incredibly silly to reduce these series down to such things as a style of building or a type of statue that appears in them. Both are such unique, powerful experiences, and they are obviously different, enough so that a short trailer can easily be likened to one over the other. Much as I would love a new Fatal Frame game, Silent Hill F is certainly not that game.